Okay, so we have a traditional web application that we want to Angularize. Okay, so the way that we're going to end up doing it is let's install a couple things here. We'll say npm install Angular, and the other thing that we're going to want to need is to get to multiple pages. So we'll say Angular UI router. And let's save this. And right now, if we go to take a look at this, right, this is how our application's working. Now, let's just see if we can end up getting Angular in here. Let's go to our, basically work off our layout file for now, and we'll say script, source, and this is going to be Angular, Angular.js. Now, of course, we don't have a route for this, so if we go to run this, and we look at our network tab, actually I lied, we do have a route, it seems. Yes, that makes sense. We do have a route set up because we did have a static route that was going to node modules. So that's great, we've got Angular. Now, if we have Angular, we should be able to do something like this. You know my, what's it called, my way that I'm just sort of, my sanity check to make sure Angular is actually loaded is to maybe go over here and let's just put on the top of our container 100. Okay? All right, we're good, right? Angular is working. Everyone's happy with Angular? Let's go back over here. You think, do we need to put ng app here for Angular to work? Yeah. We do, right? Angular's still working. How about if we get rid of Angular? And Angular is still working. The fact is Angular is not working. The fact is we're just basically using Swig here. So if we ended up, and this was something that I ran into this, some other folks ran into this as well. So how do you sort of see that? Is if we go over here and we end up viewing our page source, we'll see that all we have is the 100. This is what's returned from the browser. One of the things you could do here, if you wanted to actually output these and have these braces go to the browser, there's this raw, meaning don't mess with it, and end raw. Just a little something where you have server-side templates interacting with client-side templates. Now if I do this, my braces will be here, and if I go back here, I'll see that Angular is not set up, and I'll go back and put in Angular script source / Angular, Angular.js. And again, do we need the ng app? Yep. So let's go in and put in ng app. And now we can see we've got Angular set up. So Angular is here now. Now the other thing that we're going to want to end up doing is that we're going to want to set up our own application. And in order to set up our own application, we're going to want to have an app. And if we do this, this is going to end up breaking, and we'll get an error message because Angular says this app doesn't exist. Now, I can solve this problem pretty easily by going over here, adding a browser folder, and going over here and saying app.js, and saying Angular module app, and doing that. But what do I have to remember to do if I'm going to do that? Included in my layout file. So there is a package. This is one of those things where if you could find a way to make your life a little bit easier, you might as well do it. So let's just divert our attention just a little bit to Gulp. We did this before. Let's do it one more time. And actually, I got it to work afterwards. That's another thing that I want to show you. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to install two things that are going to make my life a little bit easier. I'm going to say npm install gulp, gulp inject, which is going to allow me to inject the names of files so I don't have to manually go and do that all the time. And also one other package called gulp watch, which is going to help me watch files. I'm going to save this. This has nothing to do with our production, so I do save dev. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and create a gulp file. And so gulp allows you to add tasks. There's any number of things that you can do with gulp tasks. One of the things that it can do here is help us out and say, hey, look, I'm going to look at all the files in a particular folder, and I'm going to end up injecting them in. Gulp can do all kinds of other things. Gulp can minify assets, concatenate files together, move things around. Gulp can help you end up deploying your application. So Gulp falls into the category of a build tool, okay? Helping you build your application. And it's going to help us build our application so we don't have to manually put files here. And there's a task that I'm going to create. And this is going to be inject.js. And just to see if this is set up here, I'm going to say console.log inject. And if I say gulp inject JS, I'll see the word inject pop up. Now, what I really want to do here is I'm going to create a variable called inject, and I'm going to require gulp inject, which I ended up doing an npm install on. And so there's a couple of things that you need to get here. You need to get the file where you're going to do the injecting. You need to get the files that you're going to inject, and you need to actually set the process up to do it and specify where you want to save the new file. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to set up here. And I'm going to say I want to target gulp.source, and I'm going to specify views layout.html. That's what my source is, my target is going to be. That's what my file is. And I'm going to specify that my sources, where my JavaScript files, gulp.source, and I'm going to do this in a way that it's important that the order comes through the right way. My app file has to load before my other files, okay? And so you're able to control the order by doing something like I'm going to specify browser /app.js, and then I'm going to do a wildcard here that says browser ****.js. So what that's going to do is that's going to basically allow me to access all of the files, all of my JavaScript files, all of my Angular files.
The ***/** will go multiple directories?
Correct. So what I'm going to be able to do here now is specify, and again, I might have to go down and look at the documentation, but what I want to be able to do is to specify target. So I'm going to use my target, and I'm going to end up piping it. Okay, so this is basically the way that Gulp ends up working. There's this whole pipeline, okay, and it's working with streams underneath the hood. Here's my target, which is this file, and you end up piping from one process to the other. And I'm going to pipe into inject with my sources. And then I'm going to specify that I want it to wind up. I could put this in another folder if I want to, but actually I'm going to put it right back in the same place. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say gulp destination, and I'll say /views. And if this is correct, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't, at least I won't get any errors when I'm running it. So again, I'm starting with my target. I'm piping. I'm using inject. So inject knows, all right, I've got some place that I'm going to inject it to. Here are the files that I'm going to inject. And it's still sitting there as a stream, but this now gives me the ability to write it out back to the views directory so that layout file is going to be saved again. So now if I go back and I try to run that, I could try this again. And I've got a syntax error. Thank you. And it tells me there was nothing to inject. So let's go back to our layout file, which is here. And we're going to put in inject.js. This is basically the placeholder that this is going to look for. And we say end inject. Let's try this now. Tells us that it ended up injecting one file. And if we go back here, we'll see that that file is loaded. It's kind of a cool thing, right? If I go back here and I decide bar.js, and I go back over here and I run this again, it'll tell me that there are two files, and that'll work. And no matter what I name another file, so if I went over here and I said hello.js, notice that it's actually showing up before this. It'll always get injected after it because of the order that I specified. That app is going to end up going first. Okay? Little gentle introduction into Gulp. Gulp is stream-based. It's basically reading these files as streams, and you have the ability to, all these Gulp packages are basically manipulating these streams. Okay? So we've got this file, but it would be nice if we could actually have this happen when any of our files end up changing. Okay? And I realize there's actually a watch that comes with Gulp, but for whatever reason, I could not get that to work. This sometimes happens. So here I'm going to require gulp.watch. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a Gulp task, and this is going to be watch inject.js. And the way that this works is I'm going to say gulp.watch, and I'm basically going to watch anything within the browser **star.js, and just to see if this is working, I'm not going to do anything with inject at the moment, but let's go back here, and we'll say, I don't know why my tab is not working right. We'll say console.log foo. And if I go back here, and I run this task, so this is going to be watch inject.js. And if I go over here and I end up deleting one of these files, I'll see that will have run. Okay? Or if I add a file, you know why this is happening? Notice I'm using Gulp watch. For whatever reason, Gulp has a watch module built in, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work when you're adding files. Or at least I couldn't get it to work. So that's why I ended up bringing in this Gulp watch, which maybe fixed something. I don't know why I did this. I really wanted to do this. And let's just double check. So now if I do that, this should fire up when I go and I add And it should fire up when I go to delete. Should fire up if I went to edit. Okay? And that's what I'm interested in. So what I'm going to do here is that since I've got this working and I've called this, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to specify that one of the things that you could do with Gulp is you could specify, hey, look, I want something to run before this task ends up running. And you could do that by putting a parameter here and putting the names of other tasks. So this task is going to be inject.js. So the only thing that this would do, if I go to run this now, you'll see that inject.js will end up running first. And what I really want to have happen is that when this ends up running, I want to call that again. So what I'm going to do here, I found that the easiest way to do that was to actually pull this logic out. I'm going to create a function here. I'll call it inject. I'm going to paste this stuff in. So when I call inject, I want inject to be called. And whenever there's a change, I want inject to be called as well. And so now if I just run this and sit it in the background, and whenever you make a change to your Gulp file, you have to restart it again. So here I'm going to do this. And what that means is that every time that I go over here, so here's my layout page, here are my 3 files. If I get rid of bar, you'll see that I ended up getting rid of that. If I end up getting rid of fizz, and let me just close this and open it back up again, you'll see that that's gone as well. So if I keep that running in the background, it's going to make my life a little bit easier, so I don't have to keep on going in and copying and pasting those files. Now, once that's done, let's just think about what we need to do for our Angular app. I'm going to start out by taking my nav tabs, and I'm going to create a directive. I'll call this directive nav tabs. So I'm going to create a directive for this application just to sort of build this slowly and get this to work. Angular could be a little bit complicated. We'll go in here, and I'm just going to say this is going to be nav tabs. Just so I know it's a directive, I'll say directive.js. Angular module, and this is going to be my app, directive, nav tabs. Don't forget it's going to be camel case. And just to see that this ends up getting loaded, we're going to return an object. And I'm just going to say template, just so I can see that that shows up there, right? Not template URL, just to see that if I run that. So a couple of things that are happening here. We don't have these, we're not loading these files. So let's load those files. And the reason why we're not loading them is that we don't have a static directive, static route for, we have one for node modules, and we want to set up one for browser too. Now, we haven't done this before, but I actually want browser to be part of the path. Okay? Reason why I want it to be is by default, that's how Gulp inject works, and it's very easy to do that. It's very similar to the way that we set up routes. And so when I do use here, I'm going to say /browser. And the way that this reads is that if a request ends up coming in, and it comes in and it's got starts out with /browser, it's going to look at this folder and see if the file ends up existing. Okay? So this gives you the ability to call your static routes, whatever you want to call them. And now if I go back here, these files should load, and you'll see that I have these nav tabs up here. Okay? So one of the things that I'm going to do is let's actually modify this. And we'll go over here for our nav tabs. And for our template, let's do a template URL. And we'll go over here. And I'm going to say slash browser, because this is all in the browser, templates. And we'll call this navtabs.html. And if I was to go back and run this, I'd get an error that this is not able to find this file. Okay? So let's get it to find that file by going in here. And I'm going to my layout. And what I'm going to do for the moment, I'm just going to take this entire thing of tabs. I'm going to yank it out from here. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to create a templates folder. Nav tabs HTML. And I'm going to paste it here. Now, I'm going to have to modify it a bit because now I'm using it here. It's going to be using Angular, right? I copied it before. It was using Swig. Now I want it to end up using Angular. So I'm going to go over here and get rid of a couple of things here. I'm just going to do an ngIf. I'll go up here and I'll say ngIf. And I have to have some way of identifying the user. Now, I'm going to go back to my source of truth a little bit, which makes my life a little bit easier. So anyone that goes to my application, there's going to be a user. Okay? But a user that actually is a real user is going to have an ID. So I'm going to specify if, in fact, on the scope there is a user that has an ID, then I'm going to show this. Same thing for this one. If, in fact, there's a user with an ID, and if there is not a user with an ID, I'll end up showing this. So now if I went back here, is it not finding my nav tabs? Yeah, so there are my nav tabs. You could see this is sort of treating this as a logged out user. Just to sort of test this out, if I end up going back to my nav tab directives, and I give this a controller, and I give my controller a scope, if I say scope.user, ID of 1 is here, and scope.user equals. By the way, I think you guys might be noticing that my app is taking a little while to restart because I think in my starting script here, one thing that I probably want to do, I didn't have any client-side code before, but now I probably just want to go over here and say ignore and just put in browser. So it doesn't restart my server every time I make a change to my client-side code, in which case I can I'm trying to see where the, I think I've got another window open, which is over here. So let me just kill this one and start this up again. npm run start dev. And I'm right back here. So what you could see, first of all, is that I'm moving over from traditional app over to an Angular app by setting up this directive. Now, the question is, what exactly does this mean? Well, first of all, let's operate under a couple of assumptions here. One thing is we're going to be determining whether or not we have a user or not from a service. So let's go over here, and we're going to inject a service which is going to be in charge of telling us whether or not we're logged in or not. I'm going to create an auth service. And what I'm going to specify is that the user is the auth service user. Now, I don't have an auth service yet, but let's go back over here, and we'll say auth service JS Angular module app. This is going to be a factory auth service. And we're going to do our source of truth. I'm going to say user is this object, and I'm going to return this user is going to point to user. So if I ended up going back here, it should now again show me in the logged out state. If I went over here and gave this user an ID of 1, it'll show me that the user is logged in. So source of truth here, this is what we're going to be playing around with, just to sort of do a quick demo here. If I go over here and I say timeout, and I'll go over here and say timeout, put a function here, let's say 2 seconds, and I'm going to do my Angular copy, and I'm going to copy someone with an ID of 1 into user. What should happen here is we're going to be logged out, and then we'll be logged in. Okay? So again, it's that whole source of truth. That's what that user object is. Again, this is the way that I set this up. Sometimes people set this up a little bit differently. A couple of different ways you could do it. So once I end up doing that, let's now figure out how we could get the user into the app. And in order to do that, let's go in and let's add, get rid of timeout. We don't need it. And I'm going to set up a couple of different pages in my application. So let's go back to our templates and our nav tabs. And instead of this going to restricted, we'll do a UI sref equals restricted instead of this. And we'll do our UI sref active is true, is active. Right? So in other words, if this is an active, this route is active, we'll have a class of active on here. This is a UI sref of home. And let's also modify our login so that this is going to be a UI sref of login, and this is going to be a same UI sref active. So again, I'll add that active class. Okay. So right now, if we went to run this, nothing really is going to happen here. We don't even have our UI router set up. So let's go back to our layout page, and let's bring in our Angular UI router. And this is under release. And again, you could look at the folder structure to figure out where things are. And once we do that, we should be able to go to our app and specify that we're going to use the dependency of UI router. And if it loaded that file correctly, we won't get any error messages. But if we go to click on this link, it'll tell us that it can't find that state. So let's go in here. We'll set up our configuration here. So we'll say .config function state provider URL router provider, and we'll do our URL router otherwise, saying if there's no matching states, then we're going to, no matching route, we're going to end up going to / URL router provider. Let's set up our states. So we're going to have a state provider, and we'll have a state, and this is going to be home. And this is going to be a URL of /. Just to see that it works, let's give it a template of the word home. Let's do our state of login. 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 And one thing we need to do, if we're using the UI router, we're going to need to, in our layout page, or whichever page we're sending back, and in fact, since now we're doing this server side, client side, we don't need this content here. Let's go over here and just put in our UI view. So we should be able to navigate between home and login and be able to refresh that and get to either one of these as well. So for our login form, let's modify this. And if we go back to our nav tabs directive, actually to our app, let's go over here. And for the template URL, let's have this be /browser templates home. And this is going to be /browser templates login. And this is going to be a template URL. So let's go in and set those up. So we've got home.html. Let's just put in a div class equals well. Say welcome. And let's go in, and for our login, let's go in here and we're going to grab from what was going on the server side. We'll grab this form and we'll adapt it for Angular. So now, if we reload this, we should end up seeing our form.
I think you forgot .html.
I think you're right. So this is going to be inside of our app, home.html. So here's login, and here's home. So let's set this up for our login. And the way that we're going to end up doing that here is that here's our login page. And again, I could name a login controller, but just to sort of keep this somewhat simpler here, let's just have scope login. And I'm just going to do a console.log just to make sure I can hit this. Console.log, do login, and put our scope here. So now, this is again a controller for this template. And if we go up to our login, instead of having this be a submit button, I'm just going to say ng click. We'll say login. Let's just see if that ends up firing. And in fact, we don't need any of our actions. We don't need the method of post. We could keep this in as a form, but since let's actually do a little bit of validation here. We'll say name equals form. And let's modify this. We don't need this name parameter, although it's not really bothering us here, but let's do an ng model. These are really credentials, right? So we'll say credentials name. Say ng model credentials dot password. Let's make both of these required. We can either do ng required or required. Either one will do the job. But once these are required, this now gives us the ability. Again, we named our form. The fact that we ended up naming our form means we could specify that we're going to disable this. And we're going to disable it if the form is invalid. So now we're using our ng model. We're specifying that they're required. We're putting them underneath this form. And so this should be grayed out until we end up putting in some data. When we click on login, we'll see do login will pop up. And let's just double check that we have our credentials by going back here. And we'll log out our scope credentials. Yeah. I probably could. I just don't really use ng-submit too often. It might be ng-submit. But I'll have to read up on it, and then I'll give you a demonstration. I'm not sure what the advantage is. Yeah, I think you may be right. Maybe you're right. I think you might be right. Okay, so if we do that, right, so we wouldn't have to click the login button, I guess. So if we do that, we could see our credentials that we have here. Now the question is, what do we end up doing with our credentials? Well, we're going to make our Auth Service be accountable for logging in. We have this Auth Service that exists. So when we go to login, let's tell our Auth Service that we want to log in, and we want to log in with these credentials. Okay? And in fact, let's actually make it so that if we are successful at logging in, then let's go over here, and if we're successful at logging in, let's do a state.go, and we'll just go back to the home page. So we have Auth Service here. Let's bring in state as well. Now again, this does not exist. Auth Service exists, but if I do this and this, Auth Service login doesn't exist. Let's go and create it. So we go up to Auth Service. We're going to add a login method. The login method is going to take some credentials. Let's make sure that we get over here by at least logging them out so we could see them. So now here, cannot read property then of undefined because we're not returning a promise, but we do in fact have these credentials here. Well, we actually have an endpoint for this, but in a Angular application, we like to hit things through our API, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring in HTTP, and we're going to do a return http.post/API sessions, and we're going to pass in our credentials. So what we'll end up doing over here, if we go to run this now, the problem that we'll run into is that that endpoint doesn't exist. Let's go back over here, and let's modify our server file. Again, we would probably put these in separate files, but here's our post for our sessions. We're going to specify /API sessions. And when you're making AJAX calls, redirects don't mean anything. You can't redirect from an AJAX call. Okay? You can send data back, but there's no concept of redirecting from an AJAX call. What you end up getting back from an AJAX call is text. So there's no redirection that can be done. Instead of actually sending back this to go to the home page here, what we'll do here is that if in fact we have a user, we're going to do return, and we'll say response.send, and let's send the user back. And if we don't have a user, let's just send our static back, our status of 401, meaning you were not able to authenticate. Okay? So we're modifying this route where, in fact, if we call a user, we're actually going to put that ID on the session. That's still valid. Okay? And in fact, we're going to send the user back. So now, if we say mo, foo, we end up getting back unauthorized. See if that makes any sense. Let's see what we're sending here. So now, if we actually went in here to see what the issue was, I'm going to do a console.log for request.body. Subtle, but let's just see what's happening. We expected this to work. Let's see why it isn't. Reload this. Say mo and foo. And when I end up looking at my request.body, I see that it's empty. And the reason why it's empty is that when I was setting this up as a traditional app, I was using URL encoded body parser. So now, and I see, you know, when we first started this, I would see like people would just throw the whole kitchen sink in here. And I got you guys to start just putting in what you needed. So here, when we end up doing body parser, we don't want URL encoded. We want to get JSON. And let's try this one more time. So now if we do mo and we do foo, we are directed back to the login page. It's still not showing us as we're logged in. So let's fix that. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to, again, our auth service is the one that's doing the work. Our auth service is holding our source of truth. So when we go to log in, let's do a then here. We're going to get back a result. And what we'll end up doing over here, we'll specify that angular.copy result.data, which is going to be the user, and we'll copy it into this user object. At which point, it'll be the same thing as like we did with the timeout. If I refresh this page, right, I'm not logged in. I go over here, I say mo, foo. Now it's showing that I'm logged in. That's great. But if I refresh the page, it's not persisting. Okay? So now, because this is an Angular application, we're going to want to do things a little differently here. Okay? One of the things we want to do is that when the application ends up loading, we're going to want to hit a path to see if we're logged in. We didn't have to do this with a traditional web application. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have another path for our session. And it's going to basically get us as a user if we're authenticated. Okay? And it's going to be fairly simple to do, where we're going to create another route. And this route is not going to be logging us in, but it's going to be telling anyone who accesses it, it's going to be telling our browser whether we are logged in. And it's going to do it by doing a get to API sessions. And real simply, I'm going to just ask the question. If response locals user, okay, meaning that you logged in, okay, if you did, I'm going to return response.send response locals user. Otherwise, response send status, you're not authorized, 401. Now, what I should be able to do with this is that if I go back here, if I was to try to access that route, API sessions, it'll say unauthorized. But if I go back here and I log in with Larry and foo, bar, thank you, bar, and I go over here and I say API sessions, I end up getting back Larry. Okay? So what we're going to do here is, let's do two different things. And let's also set up another thing that's going to allow us to end up logging out. Might as well do this. It's just the sort of the opposite of logging in. Let's put this code in here. And what we'll do is we'll specify, and we have to put this in the right spot. So under our nav tabs directive, we've got this form button here. I'm going to get rid of this form. I'll keep the button here. And over here, I'm going to say ng click, and this is going to be log out. So again, this is on my directive for my nav tabs. And when I go to log out, I'll say scope log out. And this is going to be a function. And just to see that this is set up, let's say console.log, logging out. Go back here. We'll log in. Larry, foo, bar. And if I click on log out and I have the console open, I should see logging out. Well, what do we want to do when we log out? Well, we are going to tell our auth service log out. And when you're done logging out, let's say state.go, and we'll go back to the home page. So we're going to need our state up here. So how does our auth service end up logging out? Well, what we could do here is if we went up over here to our auth service, we could specify that when you log out, here's a function. And so when we go to log out, let's return HTTP delete. And this is going to be slash the API sessions. We're getting rid of the sessions. Okay? And we're not really, don't really have to do anything after that, but we want to get rid of that session on the server. So now if we end up, we're just going to have to change our path here. What will happen if we try this now? Notice that whenever we reload the page, it doesn't show that we're logged in. We'll fix that in a second. We say mo.foo, and we click on log out, and this path doesn't exist, this route, because again, when we're using Angular, or we're using, when we make calls to the server, we do it through APIs. So here, we're just going to do slash API sessions. We're going to destroy the session again. Ajax requests have no redirects. Response.send status 200. And so that at least will show us some functionality here. Mo, foo. When we log out, we don't see any errors here. And the other thing we want to do when we end up logging out is we want our auth service, who's the source of truth, we'll do a then, and we'll just copy an empty object into user, which is our source of truth. And if we wanted to, there's nothing really to return here, but when we're done here, we'll end up going back. So what this should do, unknown provider auth service. Oh, thank you. Is that the error, though? Yes, thank you. So here we're going to do mo, foo, log in, log out. But if we do log in again as Larry, and we reload the page, we're not logged in. So this is where what we want to do is that when our app ends up loading, we want to do a quick check up on the server. So So when there's a hard page reload, we're going to do a quick check on the server and see if we can find the user. So what we're going to do is we'll go up here. Now this you haven't, I don't know if you've seen this before, but one of the things you could do is you could attach a run block. And what the run block will do is it'll run when the application loads. And a config block, you can only pass in providers. You can't inject regular services into config. With run, what we're going to do is we're going to inject our auth service, and we're simply going to call an auth service. We'll say auth me. We're going to have auth try to find me, assuming I had logged in already. Again, don't forget a hard page reload. We're still using sessions on the server. They exist. We can make a call to that /API sessions. And so with the auth me, we're simply going to go over here. And we'll go over here and we'll specify HTTP get API sessions. And what we're going to end up doing, if we were successful in getting that, then we're going to have a user. And what we can do is the same code here, but we're going to have a user, so we'll have a result.data. Now what's going to happen is that if I run this now, auth service, thank you. Auth service, auth service. Again, it's going to do a quick call when the app loads. And look at that. Shows me that I'm logged in. I can log out. Refresh. Okay, that's fine. You get that error that you're unauthorized, but that's the way with an Angular app, you can determine whether you're logged in or not. Now, I just want to specify one other thing. We're being very passive with our user object in our auth service, meaning that we're not doing anything. We could do something and pop something up when the user ends up logging in or that sort of thing. If there was some event that you wanted to call when the user ended up logging in, you could do it. And you wanted other services to be aware of it, you could do it. And the way that you could end up doing it would be by using your root scope and broadcasting, and you could broadcast whether you're logged in or whether you're logged out. But working passively with this object of truth will pretty much do the same thing for you. Okay? You'll see it two different ways. Some people like to broadcast root scope. Some people like to use an object like this. I tend to use an object like this. Sometimes you might have a need for doing both. I mean, for instance, maybe if you have to go and maybe after a user logs in, you need to go up and fetch their shopping cart or something along those lines, okay? But you want to display it up at the top, then you might want to do a broadcast on the root scope, and when someone ends up getting logged in, you could end up going and getting their shopping cart and showing their shopping cart.
So run basically runs that function first.
It'll run it after the application is loaded, so you can be assured that everything is loaded in your application.
So it's like just run it once?
Only runs once. Only runs once. And you can see multiple config blocks, multiple run blocks. Okay? Config blocks are used for configuring. Run is used for running things once the application loads. Okay? So once we end up doing that, right, we could really sort of prove that this is going to work by going in here, and we could log in Larry in one browser. Again, we open him up. This is the same browser, right? He's going to be logged in both these places. If we were to go and do a new window here, and we go and log in for Mo, Mo's logged in here, and Larry is logged in here. And you have the ability to log them out as well. By the way, if you wanted to just play around with this, right? You reload. Larry's still logged in. If you wanted to log Larry out by getting rid of his cookie, you could go over here. And here's the cookie. You can see the name of the cookie, connect SID, because it's actually was another, used to be a module called connect that you would use for this. You want to get rid of this, delete it. Now Larry's logged out. Okay? All right, so that was something that I wanted to show you folks, just so you saw. And I'll put this repo up so that you could take a look at it. Stop recording this.